Welcome to Paul or Nothing, the place to get all of your Paul all of the time. Join me, your host Sam Wiles, as we discover the history, the music, and the man behind it all, Paul McCartney. To get in contact with the show, email us at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com.
The idea of wanting to get back on the road was one that McCartney may have been feeling as early as 1968. Only 2 years after the Beatles infamously decided to take the band off the road and go at it solely in the studio. Like his father before him, Paul was designed for the life of show business. He is a born entertainer and is most at home in front of thousands of people. And, as of 2017, when this episode is being recorded, he has more than enough songs to carry him across a seemingly endless Dylan-esque tour that sees him never not having plenty to fucking do. But that wasn't always the case. The McCartney post-Beatles band experiment titled Wings was, designed and, somewhat succeeded to scratch that itch, that desire to get back on stage on a band and relive those highs again. There was the back to basic if shambolic Wings University tour. There was the escapist escapade. There was the Wings Over Europe tour. And it had been at least 2 years since the Wings 73 UK tour, which was essentially just backing the very disappointing Red Rose Speedway. It's hardly Shea Stadium 65, is it? There's a decidedly stop-start inconsistency, shall we say, to this band's touring, which of course is exacerbated endlessly by the ever-changing lineup. But, now on the eve of the tour, that would ultimately stretch from September 1975 to October 76, McCartney was seemingly on the verge of finally reliving his glory days as a Beatle. So he's got the awards, the adulation from peers and critics for Band on the Run. So now, if this tour goes well, those two things together will kind of be the final confirmation of adoration from the wider public and, pop culture altogether that eluded Wings to this point. 5 years after the breakup of the Beatles, Paul was finally about to prove that he didn't need anyone else to be successful. Except the band. But what stood out to me when I was going back through all these early Wings gigs, and let me tell you, there's a fantastic collection of them on YouTube, but what stood out to me about them immediately is that the setlist really wasn't defined at all by that point. I mean, don't get me wrong, Paul knew which songs to pick to some degree, but in this ragtag run of Wings, there was this seemingly lack of surefire hits to cover the whole concert. We don't have Band on the Run by this point, and again, some of my rarely played faves, songs like Wildlife and Sea Moon are played here, but there weren't many classics. Now, when we find ourselves in 1965, Wings have just come off the end of Band on the Run, and that's an album we'll be regularly referring back to in this episode. So if you haven't downloaded that one yet, I suggest you go back and do so. But yeah, Band on the Run, like we said, was chock-a-block with hits and mega hits alike, such as the title track and Jet, that would now perfectly slot into those lulls between Live and Let Die and My Love. In fact, with both Venus and Mars and Band on the Run, and even then on to Wings at the Speed of Sound, would mean McCartney would have almost an entirely new and reliable setlist that would hold him steady as a live performer and a live presence forever, essentially. He's still doing the songs off this album, he's still doing the songs off Band on the Run, of course, but this kind of setlist that will kind of come together in Wings Over America will become, at least for the 70s, the defining McCartney run of songs. Wings is considered by many to be a band who only made good singles, and whilst that may have been true, and a point that certainly existed before Band on the Run, it's still one that I would kind of contend with, of course, but I can genuinely empathise and see why a large section of the public would indeed see it that way. The album that we'll be discussing today is a foray into a new era for McCartney now. He's had the little mini rebirth, that phoenix rising from the ashes, that was Band on the Run. In many ways, this is the difficult second album of McCartney's career. Again, this was time to consolidate gains, this was time to push forward, to make the counter-offensive, and this time it was going to be big. Hello, and welcome to another edition, chapter, episode, supplement, issue of Paul or Nothing, the place to get 99.9% of your Paul, 99.9% of the time. So yeah, this is a rather large turning point for us now, folks. Some of you, well, I hope most of you may remember all the way back to our first episode where I basically came out of the closet. I came clean. I confessed that, unlike my last podcast, Down in the Hole, where I knew Tom Waits' entire discography, I am not, and still am not, a Paul McCartney completist. Before I started the show, I didn't know anything past Band on the Run, unless it was on the compilation album, Wings Greatest, and nothing from Venus and Mars, I repeat, nothing made it onto that disc. Shocking, I know. This is really going to be some virgin territory for us here today, folks. If I take one more step, you'll be the furthest away from home I've ever been. I also just want to take the time to say thank you to you, the listener, you, the fans, who have slowly started to grow in number and support the show. It's always great to see the figures rolling in on Podbean. It shows you how many people from which country, from which state, even which little area of the world are downloading episodes, and what device is it on, and what time of the day. It's facts that really rub my ego in a wonderful way. But to those of you who are watching us on YouTube, listening on your device or however, thank you for supporting the show. There are going to be some new developments for the show that I'll be announcing after this episode. Some wonderful things, taking the show to the next level. Keep your ears open for that. A few of you have reached out and you tell me what you think about the show, especially on the Twitter, and it's a wonderful ride for me, and it keeps me energized with this project that I hope you're all enjoying, because I really enjoy doing it, and it's fun going through the albums for me as well, of course. Obviously, we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping now just to start the show off, as we always do. If you want to get in contact with the show, if you want to say anything at all, whether you agree with points I've made, whether you disagree, whether you just want to tell me how bloody good the show is. Do you have any stories with about Paul? Have you been to any of his gigs? Did I get anything wrong? Is there any trivia that I didn't cover? I do want to hear all of these stories, folks. We are a Paul McCartney community, and I always find all of your stories far more interesting than mine. Please join us on the Twitter, that is @McCartneyPod. The Twitter is always growing, always love putting out polls and GIFs and photos and all of that kind of Twitter garbage, but it's very fun to maintain, and it's great talking to those of you out there who kind of make yourself a little more prominent on the Twitter, and it's nice to see the community growing. Follow the blog, which is paulmccartneypod.wordpress.com. That's just a kind of little hub where I upload certain articles and links to all the episodes and anything to do with the show. That's just kind of your central hub for everything there. And of course, obviously the best way to help out the show, we don't have merch yet. Some merch will be being worked on by a friend of the show, Danny, who did the logo. And yes, we have been informed that the logo is spelled incorrectly. I can't believe after 6 months of the show we haven't spotted that, but that will be being changed soon. Hopefully maybe a different colour as well, just to kind of signify the new era. But yeah, the best way to help out the show is through the iTunes reviews. That helps us get our name out there on obviously the biggest platform. Like I was saying, whenever I'm on Podbean, a good 60-65% of you are on the iPhone. So the best way to help out the show is to leave us an iTunes review, leave us 5 stars, say something nice about the show, and that tiny contribution will take a few seconds, will help us out in a big way. But let's crack on with catching up with Paul in the wake of a certain album that rhymes with Round on the Run that I promise not to keep talking about too much for the rest of this podcast. But our story doesn't start with the band, it starts with the old band. This is kind of the laying down of arms between Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Around the time of Venus and Mars, we find ourselves in late 1974, early 1975, and the Lennon-McCartney relationship has become increasingly estranged. Whilst the vitriol of the post-breakup bickering was largely gone, this was likely due to the fact that the respective contract with Northern Songs Limited was over, meaning they could each profit independently from their own tunes, and the chains of the Beatles were finally broken. Both had substantial solo careers, and John had even come around on the band's swan song manager, Alan Klein, of whom he was now also suing. Despite this room to grow, there was still a coldness between the pair, with no real effort from either party to patch things up. This was also exacerbated by the fact that the two of them were separated by the Gulf of the Atlantic Ocean. In a rather fittingly poetic downturn, Paul was denied a visa to the US because of his repeated pot drug offences, and John, conversely, was also on thin ice with the US government because of his anti-war, anti-establishment politics. But this meant John, who was already in America, ever decided to leave, he would be very, very unlikely indeed to ever be able to re-enter. This means he was ultimately stranded in a country whose government really didn't want him there. In 1974, whilst on a regular holiday visa, which he could still obtain, McCartney decided, seemingly on a whim, to travel to New York and break this silence. The period when Paul decided to drop in on John was now during what's known as the famous Lost Weekend, where John leaves Yoko and swans off with May Pang, Yoko's assistant, in this kind of hedonistic, drug and sex-fueled 18-month bender, which, I can only imagine would make a fantastic HBO series. And this is when McCartney decides to check in on John. Maybe he's spoken to Yoko behind the scenes. Maybe Yoko wants someone even further back from Paul's past to maybe rekindle thoughts of the past in John, maybe persuade John to come home. That being said, in Howard Stone's book Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney, obviously we had Howard on the show, describes this potentially fiery encounter as surprisingly cordial, which also sounds like a wonderful name for a children's drink. This would be the first encounter that would essentially lead Paul into somewhat believing that the relationship was fully back to where it was, back before the Beatles kind of started turning sour. What I get from the literature here is that Lennon was rarely instigating a lot of these encounters, if any, and that kind of leads on to what we talk about now, because any of these meetings are reported by the press and begin to start stirring stories of like a Beatles reunion, which had, to be fair, been around since like 1970, but it started picking up traction once again, and it kind of teased fans of a reformation, which probably put a dampener on any time they ever saw each other, because they just knew that people would be expecting them to like each other and expecting them to get back together. There was always that kind of pressure in the back of their minds, I imagine. Later in 1975, Paul continues his interaction with Lennon when he kind of appears out of nowhere at his doorstep to perform an impromptu Christmas caroling session with Linda and the kids. Photographer Bob Gruen, who just happened to be there at the time, he's the guy who famously took the iconic photo of Lennon in the New York City vest. Look it up on Google, you'll know the one I'm on about. He was there at the time and described the encounter as a very happy one. He says, "They all seemed like giddy old school chums, hugging, patting each other on the back, like old high school buddies who hadn't seen each other in a long time and really liked each other." It's stories like this that really take the sting out of the McCartney feud with Lennon. That kind of overshadows much of their solo careers. Many fans just can't come to grips with the party coming to an end and presumably wish to see a bright future ahead of Paul and John's infighting. It can't be denied that these two men were both very dear to each other and deeply respected each other's work, but best buds they were not anymore. It does take a bit of effort to come to the realisation that it's not their responsibility to get back together for our sake. Obviously we'd like it, but these are humans, they have their own lives and their own wants, and this is just the way the story goes. And unfortunately, though I do have to report the truth on this podcast, and the truth of the matter is, as many Mackett and Lennon books seem to hint at, is that Paul and John's relationship just wasn't the same as it had been before. Mostly from via John to Paul, they were now vastly different people with increasingly wider circles of different people surrounding them. And what broke the camel's back was the fact that Paul was just too darn friendly for the crotchety, cranky, antisocial John. At least it seems. As Paul became more and more comfortable with John again, he also became more and more casual, kind of just turning up out of nowhere, with guitars and ukuleles in that kind of classic Beatles stories way, just expecting John to kind of drop whatever he's doing and be free to accept him. And this may have been fine when they were bachelors, but now John had a family and a wife, and eventually he started asking Paul to ring from now on. I think Yoko rang, perhaps, and told him this. I can't remember the story exactly. But this wound up wounding the mighty McCartney, who took it very personally. And this was the last time we turned up on John's door for some time. Jumping back somewhat, we're just after Band on the Run. Paul's earned even more Grammys. And Paul has earned even more Grammy Awards. One for Best Performance by a Duo or Rock Group for the song Band on the Run. And the album itself, Band on the Run, won Best Engineered Non-Classical Album for its engineer Jeff Emmerich, which further cemented the high-selling giant as a pop culture classic, as well as the critical acclaim that Wings had always kind of been skirting at. The actual interesting thing about that Grammy Awards show that night, though, was when Paul was on his way home with Linda and the kids in the backseat of the car, kind of Grammy Award in hand, he was pulled over for running a red light. Now, the officer, when he walked up to the car door, claimed he smelled a formidably familiar dank odour emanating from the car, and Linda had ended up being arrested for possession of 16 ounces of fresh-cut cheddar cheese kush on her person. How big was her fucking purse again? 16 ounces? She later went on to say that It was hers, as Paul was not an American, and this would affect his visa. Paul, by this point, was not the sort to carry much cash on him at all, especially after the incident in Lagos when he and Linda were accosted by a gang of local crooks. So he didn't even have enough to pay her $500 bail to get her out. Luckily, former Apple executive Peter Brown, who just happened to be in a nearby hotel, managed to lend him the money and get Linda out that day. This was now the McCartney's third drug conviction in 3 years. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and lecture McCartney. Who knows? Maybe he didn't even know he'd ran a red light, and maybe the policeman targeted McCartney personally. Who knows? I remember a story about when Paul first met Dylan, where Dylan's roadie was always the one who looked after the weed and carried the weed, so that if the police came in, he would take the fall. And I'm not saying Paul was doing that to Linda at all. Maybe he did. I don't know, but maybe just get someone else to carry it, Paul. Stop carrying your weed. Stop carrying 16 ounces of weed on you as well. The kids aren't going to smoke 3 ounces each, are they? He just needs, a roadie, an intern, a road manager, anybody, just someone who can keep the weed off his person. It's getting ridiculous now. New band, new album, new locale, part 1. So Paul wanted to get a new band together and take them on holiday. But this wasn't just any old McCartney family holiday. No, this was very much in Paul's style. This was very much a working man's holiday, with Paul's intent on reconnecting with the American roots of his songwriting. Like Band on the Run, there was a sense of worldliness by the choice to head over to America. After all, this was the band that would soon be touring in a big way in this country, so getting a feel for the climate, both musically and literally, made a lot of sense. And again, I'm sure there's some lovely tax benefits in recording in Nashville and New Orleans. Perhaps if you record during Mardi Gras, you'll get some free beads in a wet t-shirt contest, as well as cheaper recording costs. This brief period of respite would also be another good time for the band to reconnect and get some much needed practice and live rehearsals in before the tour. However, unlike Band on the Run, this journey would not be made by just the 3 core Wings Musketeers. No, for this bigger post-Band on the Run album, we were going to need a bigger band. So, now we're on the 4th, this is the kind of 4th official lineup of Wings. So, not exactly the best evidence one could use to prove how fully functioning this band was, nor does it go great lengths to refute the claims that Paul is difficult to work with. But yeah, onto this new band. I'm sure Paul was pleased to get some fresh blood in, I can sense, into the group to lift the strains off himself and Denny, as well as wash the taste of Henry McCullough and Denny Sewell out of his mouth. But I'm sure there's a point when it comes just like filling in a position like any other job, and the vibrancy and the fun of first putting the band together must wane somewhat. But, it's Paul's band, and Paul's band needs what Paul's band needs. New to the fold, we have tiny, youthful Glaswegian guitarist Jimmy McCulloch. No, not Henry McCulloch, the last guitarist. No, we have a second lead guitarist for Wings now, called McCulloch. Christ, we have 2 McCartneys, 2 Dennys, and now 2 McCullochs. This is getting more incestuous than a tipsy Fleetwood Mac dinner party. Cool piece of trivia, though, about Jimmy McCulloch. His first band, Thunderclap Newman, recorded a song called Something in the Air, which went straight to number 1. He was actually 15 at the time when it topped the charts, which earned the record then of the youngest English man to ever have a number 1 in the UK. Pretty cool, eh? That's like a very nice qualification to get him in Wings as well. The thing is, though, Jimmy is the first introduction to the man now where I have kind of accepted it without any resistance at all. Like, I've just gone, yeah, it's a good choice. This doesn't seem like... No, this doesn't mean I know anything about him as a guitarist at all. No, what I mean is that he seemed like a good fit. One of the main reasons for him wanting to join Wings was that he was looking for a more stable gig. When he was asked about the band, he said, I'm sick and tired of being in and out of bands. I want something that's going to go down and on record and is going to be appreciated, instead of always being in bands that so few people hear. That's a really old comment for such a young guy. Though when you've had a number 1 hit when you were 15, maybe you'd feel the same way. But he was a very competent guitar player, a blues player no less, but being a younger guy brought up around all genres of music. It meant he didn't bring the kind of baggage that Henry McCullough brought, and more importantly, Jimmy injected a bit of youth into the band, of whom now the members were all well into their 30s. I mean, when you look at him on stage next to Macca, he looks like a babe with Madonna from like a 15th century mural. He also doesn't stick out like a sore thumb in the promotional material like Henry did, which also helps him out somewhat. Apparently the young Jim was still a bit of a wild card off stage, just like his past self. And in writing the notes for a bunch of the other episodes, yes, Venus and Mars is coming out very late, I'm very sorry. I've been discovering that Jimmy is quite the little tyke. Legend tells of a rather chirpy and friendly, sober Jimmy who became worryingly rowdy after a few drinks. Wings mainstay and saxophonist Howie Casey described the situation as thus: "He had a London accent normally. Soon as he had a drink, though, he became Scottish. 'I'll see you!' And it was all that." Jimmy also had a bit of a mouth on him. That's something we're also going to come across as well. He was understandably confident as a musician, but as anyone will tell you, there was only room for one ego in Wings. Jimmy's most egregious move was that he actually brought Linda to tears over her ability to play. I mean, he's not wrong, but you don't tell her. Again, only a McCartney can call Linda shit and get away with it. Denny sums it up here when he says, "I like Jimmy quite a lot, but he was trouble. He and Paul clashed quite a bit." British drummer and karate teacher Jeff Britton also followed suit, and unfortunately, there's not a lot to say about this poor chap, as he doesn't make it past this part of the story. Britton was brought on after the success he had with several other bands prior, and he did the same pretty much after he left Wings. He didn't it literally just seemed to be a short holiday where he was hanging out with Paul McCartney. Really, it didn't affect his career too much, positively or negatively, and he kind of just carried on doing what he did. So best of luck to him, really. The fact of the matter is, he just didn't gel with the rest of the band as much as everyone would have liked. Again, Wings is more about people to hang out with rather than specifically the most appropriate musicians. Sadly, none of the sources point to anything as juicy as Henry McCulloch's departure. Maybe they were just different people, who knows. He was a steady drummer, he was a safe-ish, not particularly dull or enlightening choice, but as of now, he is and always will be the shortest term member of Wings to date. Britton's only interaction with the band would appear on the tapes from the band's first Band on the Run recording sessions, post-Band on the Run recording sessions with the new lineup. This would take part in Nashville for about 6 weeks of the McCartney's American holiday run, and I'm not sure if Paul has ever really had a holiday in his life, and I just know he never ever intended to stay away from the studio on any break like this. But what is often forgotten is that taking part in all of this would require both newcomers, Britton and McCulloch, to move to Nashville and essentially throw away their lives, whatever they're doing. They're not just a band touring in the UK, in the city where they live, that they have to now upstick. And it just seems like McCartney's kind of throwing them in the deep end a little bit. This wasn't a bad move for Linda or Denny, who they were now hardened veterans of Lagos, but you can see how Jimmy and Jeff may have felt. Now, remember how badly it went when Paul tried to rush the band together for Wildlife? Well, now he seems to be flirting with doing that again, with the expectations of Band on the Run now behind them. Though the songs that the band managed to get out were not necessarily pointed towards any particular album, they still managed to churn out quite a few little hits that would be sprinkled across the rest of the Wings discography. The first song recorded at the Sound Shop studio was their first single in almost a year, which was Junior's Farm, followed swiftly by another less notable Wings number, Sally G, as well as the powerhouse tracks on Venus and Mars, Letting Go, Medicine Jar, and Lovin' Song. Other notable tracks put to tape here included a composition written by Paul's father, Jim McCartney, called Walking Through the Park with Eloise, as well as the track that would go on to title Linda's only and rather notably promiscuous album, Wild Prairie. Ernie Winfrey, an engineer at those sessions, described everyone as being totally in awe of Paul. Whilst not the most iconic of recording sessions in terms of timeless songs, Paul was still clearly a force to be reckoned with in the studio and is showing no signs of slowing down, running out of ideas, or having any less energy. Rather interestingly, for me at least, during this stay, Paul and Linda also finished a track they started back in the Ram sessions. This song was Hey Diddle, a song I'm dying to talk about on what will be the first of our singles episodes, which also has taken forever to come out. Christ, this show is a shambles, isn't it? Now, despite this promising recording and rehearsal session, as pointed out in John Blaney's book Lennon and McCartney Together or Alone, there was an air of uncertainty about this new group. The core of the band, the McCartneys and Lane, are still there obviously, but their greatest success was when there was literally just them, and these extraneous members of the group have never seemed to last. So it makes sense that Paul was becoming quite wary of them. If things ever got too serious with any band members, it would Paul, essentially, who's taking the greatest risk. If you're a working artist and you want success in a pop band, well, Wings is just perfect then for you, isn't it? But Paul has also not shown the greatest talent for picking members thus far, has he? The group itself wasn't even announced as a group until November 1974, and the album would be out in less than 4 months. But that doesn't mean the band members are finalised just yet. Does it ever? It looked like Paul was repeating history with his sense of trepidation when news of a lack of official paperwork and contracts and promises of royalties for the new members of the band put everyone in an awkward position. Before his untimely departure from the band, Jeff Britton offered us a little insight into the inner dynamic of the band when he said, "There were talks of contracts at the beginning, but we decided it was better if nothing was contracted. If you're a real pro and you've got a tour booked, you don't just phone up and say, 'I'm not coming.' That's just not on." Just hearing that quote, it's so funny to experience such dedication from a guy who would quit the band only weeks later. After the departure of Britton, the band would again sorely need a drummer to fill in the band. As a replacement, Wings inducted another drummer with an Anglophile surname, namely Joe English. This chap was instead from Rochester, New York. Rather like his ancestor Denny Sewell, he found a random ad for a drumming audition for an unknown band, and just like his forebearer, he too found himself in a dingy, dark basement with Paul McCartney, who, after a little jam, offered him the job on the spot. He would remain a staple member of the band until the second big breakup during the London town sessions. While no Denny Sewell, in my opinion, he was certainly just as energetic. He was a whole less derivative than Britton, and his loud and brash drumming style would be perfect for the touring eras, the Venus and Mars, the Speed It Sound era. And hey, the guy would even go on to sing a song. New Band, New Locale, Part 2. With the Wings 4.5/5 lineup, the McCartneys just decided to capitalise on this minor sense of stability within the group, and Wings set its sights firmly on New Orleans. As opposed to Lagos, this move, within the realm of my own personal zeitgeist, seems to be the better choice. Obviously, there is a massive legacy of blues and jazz that is impossible to ignore in New Orleans. This is the city of Treme. This city has been alive with music for over 100 years and has churned out countless classic musicians and singers. And with such a track record for, the town, coupled with Paul's constant desire to develop his own personal sound, you can see why he was eager to attend. And as per usual, with all the Wings foreign trips of this nature, there was probably some financial incentive, whether tax loopholes or recording prices, to also draw McCartney to New Orleans. So we're here again. Paul's doing his imperialist British thing again. Very much like Lagos, he wanders around, meets musicians, absorbs sounds. The Wings' entourage, Smith recalls, went to see many local acts performed during those few weeks in New Orleans, which had been a long-held wish for Paul to do for quite some time. Unfortunately, the crush and the chaos created by frantic fans who mobbed them at every turn meant meeting everyone on the extensive list impossible. The McCartneys were not nobodies in New Orleans, it seems. Speaking of the experience, Danny Lane said, We met all those players. We were very much a part of the scene down there at the time. However, Paul was very much aware of the possible reaction from locals, especially based on the last time he tried to do this. New Orleans is another place that is proudly defensive of its local sound and culture. On the subject of sound stealing, Paul said, Mainly we're coming here to make our own album. I don't like to come to a place and use too much of the local talent, because you get people saying, oh, they're taking the style. So generally, we pretty much keep to ourselves, unless there's another special thing we'd like, and we'd ask someone to help us on it. Recording engineer Alan O'Duffy hired Tony Dorsey, a trombonist and local, to lead the horn section and make arrangements. Dorsey, in turn, hired many New Orleans musicians of whom he had attended college with to play horns. When speaking of recording in New Orleans, Paul said, There was no sort of Cajun feel, really, except for one song, a bonus thing we did, My Carnival, which was very taken from the local feel. Wings recorded My Carnival at Sea Saint the day after Mardi Gras, with locals George Porter, the bassist in The Meters, and Benny Spellman singing backup. The song's piano, horns, hand-clapped rhythm and celebratory vocals echoed the music of Professor Longhair, Huey Piano Smith and the Clowns, and other classic New Orleans rhythm and blues acts. In addition to My Carnival, McCartney recorded his impression of Professor Longhair's carnival classic, Mardi Gras in New Orleans, aka Go to Mardi Gras, He also sang and played the song in person for the amused Professor Longhair. Whilst in New Orleans, the McCartneys obviously did not want to be seen, but were irresistibly tempted by the lure of Mardi Gras. So Paul, Linda and the kids all dressed head to toe in full clown regalia to join in with the oblivious, debaucherous crowds and obviously take part in the obviously family-friendly activity that goes on at Mardi Gras. One last little point I wanted to bring up before we start to work our way onto the album is that whilst the band were stateside, Paul somehow convinced everyone to record the song Proud Mum, created for the sole purpose of being included in a television advertisement for a brand called Mother's Pride Bread. Not sure if this brand still exists or not, but yeah, the song will be featured in another singles episode in the future. But what I can't find is a clip of the commercial, so if anyone has a link or can forward me some footage, please get in contact with me at paulmccartneypod@gmail.com. After the trip to America, the band returned home and began recording the final songs and doing much of the mixing at Abbey Road Studio. The release for Venus and Mars, the album we're talking about today, was held aboard the Queen Mary ship and was quite the affair. One of the most high-profile guests at this party for the release of the album was in fact George Harrison, which further flared rumours of a Beatles reunion. But it was nice to see that he and Paul were on good enough terms to at least be seen in a public venue with each other. But it does get quite annoying now because it's getting to the point where even if these guys walk past each other on the street, there's going to be a Beatles reunion topic of conversation cropping up somewhere. Just as a little aside, this is quite a sad and rough place in George's life. He had just lost his first wife to a close friend, Eric Clapton, and that's probably pushed him into a bit of a cocaine habit, and now he's partaking in an affair with Ringo Starr's wife. So let's get on to Venus and Mars. Venus and Mars is an album that I first listened to after I bought it at a record shop in Birmingham, and when I picked it up, I looked at the cover and I really wasn't that impressed. It looks a bit cartoony and a bit zany, and it doesn't do anything for me in terms of legitimising the band. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not McCartney wearing a cardigan on the front of Red Rose Speedway, and I'm not saying they need an Iron Maiden zombie skull on the front either. It's just, I want something that just looks kind of interesting and kind of cool, and something that I'd like to look back at again. And goes back to the fact that it's not a particularly iconic album. It has a charming simplicity to it, but aside from, red and yellow, it's just nothing to write home about. So the main image, we have the titular Venus and Mars, which are represented by red and yellow spheres on a black background, which always to me looked like snooker balls, and it turns out it actually is a pair of snooker balls. And for me, the ingenuity of capturing such a shot as a work of art is actually a lot more interesting than the front cover itself. But I'll tell you what, one thing it does do is that the fact that it's not a painting gives it a very tactile quality, which is kind of key in selling that kind of new Wings space age sound. When you open it up, there's the inner fold, and it contains some great pictures of the band mucking about in the desert. But it's symptomatic of a pet peeve of mine where it's just drenched in that overall over-Americanization of Wings in this time period. Wings on America is just over the horizon, and this subliminal imagery is just kind of being laid down for the future. Wings is a big band in America. You will now believe this. Like all good albums, the back cover of the sleeve has all the lyrics completely on there and in an easy-to-read format. One thing I will say, I am looking forward to getting the poster that comes with the Venus and Mars album, which is just some more of those wonderfully candid Lennon McCartney snapshots. I want that framed and hung up on my wall alongside my old and tattered Band on the Run poster. Let's move on to some of the critical reception of the album, because it's interesting how people view Venus and Mars, because like I said earlier, it is that second album, and I feel like people always want to love Venus and Mars and rate Venus and Mars more than they do. Red Rose Speedway actually was a lesson to me in many ways, as it taught me not to worry too much about a new McCartney album, as there would always be something that eventually I would like after more and more listens, but that doesn't make it a good album. What it does mean is that I'm just weak and fickle in my choice of music, and I'm easily worn down. And without going too much into detail, there really isn't that much contemporary material, unfortunately, for Venus and Mars. There's a website called Rock's Back Pages, and they show a few free old issues of Melody Maker and stuff, and it's £10 billion a month to join. It's ridiculous. So unfortunately I won't be able to use that, but some of the sources that I have found, and people are pretty split on Venus and Mars. There's no real party saying it's particularly bad. you've either got people saying, it's kind of okay, or people saying, it's pretty good. So it's two parties either side of mediocre. No one's saying it's brilliant, no one's saying it's terrible. What I will say though is that just looking at the record sales alone, I think it's safe to say that it performed more than admirably. Robert Nelson in Rolling Stone, this is Rolling Stone in 2001, mind you, he says, "It's symbolic that Venus and Mars comes with more extraneous junk, not all of it in the grooves, than it can sustain. 2 posters, 2 gummed decals, a flashy inner cover, etc. Perhaps this is the emphera of fame, but it's not really as cosmic as Paul and Linda thinks it is. Indeed, it is more of an inadvertent definition of artistic emptiness. These 2 geese who have laid a golden egg in a land where Michelangelo, Antonio and Norman Rockwell have somehow become soulmates. All of us are going to be expected to pay the price." Robert Christgau, obviously one of the great McCartney critics, said, "Superficially, which counts a lot for McCartney, his New Orleans venture is his most appealing post-Beatles album. Straight rock and roll with a few pop detours and one excursion into When I'm 64 nostalgia. So clear in its melodies, mix and basic pulse that his whimsical juxtapositions, Robots on Main Streets, Rue de Rivoli, Cheek by Jar with Alan Toussaint, might sound like they might make some sense. Don't get me wrong, they probably don't, but McCartney is a convinced fool. But when the music is so coherent, it doesn't matter so much." Howard Soons, who wrote Fab, An Intimate Life of Paul McCartney, that we quoted earlier, in the same book he said, "Taken together, the songs on Venus and Mars were much weaker than Band on the Run, with more than the usual amount of whimsy and silliness. Choices such as this serve to debase the McCartney currency." And Howard hits it on the head there once more. Going into this album, you're going to have to view it in the mode of, yes, I know it's not going to be as good as the last album, but I'm going to try. Band on the Run was a massive album, to say the least, an elephant in the room. And like I said last time, when you do well in this business of show, general audiences expect something bigger and better the next time around. So the heat was really on this time, as Band on the Run had no expectations surrounding it. And without deifying an album of pop songs, how does one exactly follow Band on the Run? Well, I suppose you just simply try, don't you? Though a better question is, do you aim to repeat the chart success, or is that something that's meant to come naturally to a band? As we discussed on the last episode, there were a hell of a lot of factors on how that album turned out, more than just musicians trying harder. And there's a real problem with Band on the Run in general, for those out there wishing to explore Wings' discography, is that it's a game breaker. And I remember saying even back then that it was the closest that he or they ever came to recreating the Beatles in terms of quality, and its very existence demanded comparison with every other McCartney album ever since. Band on the Run is like that older brother that Wings has, that older, more successful brother for whom they will never live up to. So Venus and Mars is the difficult second album. Lightning rarely strikes twice, does it? So I shouldn't have gotten my hopes up too much for this album at all, really. It's not like we hadn't been let down before by McCartney, or gotten my hopes up with my preconceptions of any album before on this podcast. And whilst, he does have this ridiculous string of #1 albums in America, from the perspective of a guy in England, in the UK, you would have liked Macca to have this history of string hit albums, but instead he has a series over here of a bunch of brilliant and interesting albums interspersed with albums where he just released songs that year without any major significance. Venus and Mars isn't an album that's trying to replace Band on the Run. What clicked after me, after listening to Venus and Mars over and over again, was that it seems to be a spiritual take two at a Red Rose Speedway type album. It's commercial, it showcases more elements of the band as a group, it has an eclectic soundscape and genre list, and its broad, large presentation is basically everything Red Rose tried oh so hard to complete back in 1973. Recently I began to muse over whether, after the collapse of the Red Rose Speedway double album, that this album wouldn't have been a perfect opportunity to try and climb that double disc mountain again. I know that Wings Over America will kind of fulfill this role by being a triple album, but the idea that you could create 2 discs worth of material for this tour, just as a statement alone, would have been a very powerful one. We are massive, we're going to bring loads of new guns to the table, and it's all going great. And with a title like Venus and Mars, for me anyway, it would have been the perfect moniker for a double disc. One would be Venus, one would be Mars. I know it's a little wish listy, but it would have been the perfect way to display Wings' new lineup and just show them getting back on the horse. Now, after this rambling, we're going to go live to my interview with Dr. Kenneth Womack, He's again a friend of the show. He's a friend of Aaron Godervik, a guy we've had on here before. He's going to be joining me for the first of our album review sections with a guest. Previously, like, this just be the part where I talk about each song by song, and then kind of review the album at the end. Today, we're going to have a guest. Now, this is different purely because it's not just going to be my opinion. There's going to be comparison, contrasts. We might not even agree. What I will say is, though, and I probably shouldn't have done this, I actually hadn't interviewed Dr. Ken Womack separately about who he was and what he does and why I wanted him on the show. And instead, I did this kind of at the start of my talk with him here. So bear with me. If you want to just go straight into the album review, fast forward about another 40 minutes. For those of you on YouTube, it'll be in a separate video. But yeah, my interview with Dr. Ken, for the first 40 minutes, it's just me and him talking about Paul McCartney and the Beatles and the fascinating work that he does, and we also talk about the podcast as well. He was a fantastic guest. I was so happy that this first session went so well. This guy can talk interesting McCartney facts literally forever. I could have just completely switched off it and just let him go. But what I will say is I probably shouldn't have done the interview at the same time, but in the way that I did it, the mix was inseparable from the album review. It wouldn't have made sense, and I didn't want to have to bring him back on. So up next is my interview with Dr. Ken Womack, and then after about 40 minutes of meandering, we get on to reviewing all the songs on Venus and Mars. I actually can't wait to show you this. It was a really fun interview. I really hope you like it.